Gloria, justice is here, but without you, it feels hollow.
The laughter stopped like a switch had been hit. One moment, the Donahue family was laughing at some joke I didn't get, maybe about me. And the next, there was only the sound of my body smashing through the glass doors onto the stone patio. Glass burst around me like a storm of tiny diamonds, catching the glow of the lights inside. Each piece seemed to hang in the air for a breath before falling, tumbling down like frozen bolts of lightning. I felt warm red run down my left cheek, likely from a sharp bit of glass that cut me on the way through. My Italian suit, the one Miriam made me wear because you need to look the part, Carter, was torn at the shoulder and speckled with shining shards. The cloth I had saved 3 months to buy was now ripped apart like cheap paper. But here's the thing that would have stunned them. I didn't scream, swear, or even flinch. I smiled, not some wild grin, just a small, calm smile that rose from deep inside me. Because as I lay on that cold stone, surrounded by wreckage and with the taste of iron in my mouth, I knew something they didn't. They had no idea what they had lost, what they had thrown away, what they had just set in motion. I'm Carter Wells, 36, an engineer and entrepreneur. When I married Miriam 7 years ago, I genuinely believed in love. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic music and perfect lighting, but the real deal. The kind where you wake up every morning grateful that this person chose to build a life with you. She was beautiful, smart, funny, and had this way of making me feel like the most interesting person in any room. What I didn't see was that her family looked at me like I was a piece of furniture they'd inherited from a dead relative, something they'd tolerate until they figured out how to get rid of it. I wasn't from money. My dad worked construction and my mom cleaned houses to make ends meet. I grew up in a neighborhood where people fixed their own cars because they couldn't afford to take them to a shop, where going out to dinner meant McDonald's was a special occasion. I earned my engineering degree on scholarships and student loans that took me 8 years to pay off, working nights at a warehouse to cover rent and ramen noodles. The Donahues, on the other hand, had connections going back generations. They knew senators by their first names, had country club memberships that got passed down like family heirlooms, and thought struggling meant having to wait 6 months instead of 3 for their custom yacht to be delivered. I was basically a caveman who'd somehow learned to wear a suit and use proper table manners, but I had vision. While Blake spent his trust fund on expensive cars and trips to Europe to find himself, I was building something real. Donahue Enterprises had this clean energy division that was basically a joke, hemorrhaging money, producing technology that was 10 years behind the competition, and staffed by guys who treated it like a side project they worked on when they felt like it. I saw the potential immediately. Clean energy wasn't just some trendy buzzword. It was the future. And whoever got there first was going to make serious money. I threw myself into that division like my life depended on it. Because in a lot of ways, it did. I redesigned their solar panel efficiency systems, streamlined wind turbine production, developed battery storage technology that could actually compete with what Tesla was putting out. I worked 60-hour weeks while Blake played polo on weekends, and Miriam went to yoga brunches with her girlfriends, talking about juice cleanses and whatever guru they were following that month. Over 4 years, I transformed their struggling side project into a billion-dollar venture. Not million, billion. With a capital B? The clean energy division went from being the embarrassing stepchild of Donahue Enterprises to being their biggest profit center. Major corporations were lining up to license our technology. Environmental groups were praising our innovations. Industry magazines were writing cover stories about our breakthrough designs. But here's where it gets really twisted. I wasn't listed on any of the paperwork. My name didn't appear on patent applications for technology I'd designed. I didn't have equity in the division I'd essentially created from scratch. I wasn't even getting proper credit in company newsletters or press releases. When Bloomberg wrote that big feature about Donahue Enterprises' Green Revolution, they quoted Julian and Blake extensively. But my name appeared exactly once in a photo caption, spelled wrong. When I finally worked up the nerve to speak up about it, when I suggested maybe it was time to discuss my official role in the company, or perhaps some kind of profit-sharing arrangement, Miriam would give me this patronizing smile and tell me to be patient. "They'll come around, Carter," she'd say, patting my hand like I was a child who didn't understand how the grown-up world worked. "You just have to give them time to see what I see in you." But they didn't come around. They never had any intention of coming around. I was useful to them, sure, but I wasn't family. I wasn't one of them. And in their world, that meant I would always be disposable, no matter how much money I made them or how many problems I solved. Then I found the ledger I was never supposed to see. Working late nights when everyone else had gone home to their fancy dinners and charity galas, I was trying to figure out why our energy usage stats for the Newark facility weren't adding up. The numbers looked wrong. Not wrong in the way that screams mistake, but wrong in the way that makes you squint at your computer screen and wonder if you're losing your mind. Digging through filing cabinets in the basement archive room at 2 in the morning, I found a leather-bound ledger wedged between environmental impact reports. The cover was worn smooth, and when I opened it, I could smell that particular scent of old paper and ink. At first glance, it looked like standard bookkeeping, revenue columns, expense tracking, the usual corporate paper trail. But I'm an engineer, which means I'm naturally suspicious of anything that doesn't add up perfectly, and these numbers were definitely not adding up. There were entries for payments to companies I'd never heard of, firms with generic names like Coastal Consulting Services and Atlantic Resource Management. The amounts were significant, sometimes 6 figures. But there was no explanation of what services these companies were supposed to be providing. More importantly, I couldn't find any corresponding invoices or contracts in our official filing system. I spent the next 3 weeks tracing these mysterious payments, following paper trails that led to more paper trails, cross-referencing bank statements with expenditure reports. What I discovered was absolutely stunning. Blake and Julian hadn't just been sloppy with the books. They'd been running a full-scale embezzlement operation for years. Those mystery companies were shell corporations, fake businesses that existed only on paper, with bank accounts that funneled money directly into personal accounts controlled by the Donahue family. Millions of dollars that should have gone toward research and development, employee benefits, or facility improvements had instead been diverted into offshore accounts. I found records of consulting fees paid to companies that had no employees, no offices, and no actual business operations. But embezzlement was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, I discovered they'd been falsifying environmental permits for years. The clean energy division that I'd worked so hard to build was operating under fraudulent documentation. Pollution reports had been altered, safety inspections had been faked, regulatory compliance documents had been forged. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was criminal. The kind of stuff that could result in federal charges, massive fines, and prison time. The Environmental Protection Agency doesn't mess around when it comes to permit fraud, especially when it involves energy production facilities. I made backups, lots of them. I copied every document, photographed every page, and stored digital copies in multiple locations. I was careful about it, too. I never printed anything on company printers, never used company computers for searches, and never accessed the files during normal business hours when security cameras might catch me in areas I wasn't supposed to be. Over the next month, I built a comprehensive archive of their crimes. Every fake invoice, every forged permit, every illegal transfer. I organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it with official company reports, and documented every single discrepancy. Then I called Dr. Raina Lynn, an old friend from graduate school who'd gone on to become one of the most feared corporate attorneys in Washington, D.C. When I told her what I'd found, I could practically hear her grinning through the phone. "Yeah, Carter," she said, "are you telling me that Julian Donahue has been running a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme with virtually no legal safeguards in place?" When I confirmed that, yes, that was exactly what I was saying, she started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of laugh a shark might make. "How quickly can you get to D.C.?" she asked. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We were going to acquire controlling interest in Donahue Enterprises, legally and quietly, using their own carelessness against them. Family-controlled companies often get sloppy about tracking minority shareholders, assuming that because they control the biggest chunk, the little guys don't matter. But those little guys add up. Working with Raina, I began systematically approaching these forgotten shareholders, early investors, former employees who'd been granted stock options, distant relatives who'd inherited small percentages over the years. We set up shell companies to handle the purchases, making it look like routine market activity rather than a coordinated takeover attempt. Some shareholders were easy to convince. Others needed more persuasion, but when you're offering premium prices for stagnant stock, Most people don't ask too many questions. 4 months of careful maneuvering, late-night phone calls, discreet meetings in hotel lobbies, wire transfers structured to avoid triggering SEC reporting requirements. The genius was that Julian and Blake had no idea what was happening. They were so focused on their embezzlement schemes and environmental fraud that they never bothered to pay attention to something as mundane as minority shareholder transactions. By the time Blake started asking questions about unusual trading activity, it was too late. I'd reached 51% ownership of Donahue Enterprises. Not through hostile takeover or dramatic boardroom coup, but through simple legal stock purchases that their own sloppy record-keeping had made possible. I wasn't just the quiet husband anymore. I wasn't the disposable engineer they could push around. I was the majority shareholder of a billion-dollar company, and they had absolutely no clue what was about to hit them. The invitation came on cream-colored paper with embossed lettering. The Donahue family cordially invites you to join them for dinner. A time for family reconciliation and moving forward together. I knew it was BS, but this was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. They were bringing me into their den, probably planning to corner me, intimidate me, maybe even try to buy me off. What they didn't realize was that I was walking into their trap with 51% ownership, burning a hole in my pocket like a loaded tool. The dinner itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. They made small talk about the weather, asked polite questions about my work that they clearly didn't care about, and generally treated me with the kind of fake courtesy that rich people use when they're forced to interact with the help. About halfway through the main course, Julian cleared his throat. "Carter, we've been talking as a family about making changes to business structure." Blake leaned forward, wine making him bolder than usual. "We're thinking about selling off the clean energy division. There's been interest from overseas investors, and frankly, it's become more trouble than it's worth." My division, the billion-dollar venture that had saved their company from irrelevance. They wanted to dump it and cash out, probably to cover up their embezzlement or pay for legal problems when their fraud inevitably came to light. I stood up calmly. "That won't be happening," Blake scoffed. "Come on, Carter, this isn't really your call to make." "Actually," I said quietly, "it is." When I didn't sit down, Blake's face started turning red. "Sit down, Carter," he repeated, his voice taking on that entitled edge. When I said no, he snapped. Blake lurched to his feet, wine sloshing out of his glass, and before anyone could react, he had his hands on my shoulders. "You don't get to tell us no in our own house," he shouted. And then he shoved me hard toward the French doors. I could have resisted, could have stepped aside, could have deflected his clumsy drunk shove. But I didn't. I let momentum carry me backward, let my body crash through those expensive glass doors in an explosion of crystal and chaos. The silence that followed was absolute and perfect. I left that dinner with blood on my collar and fire in my chest. The second I walked through my front door, I was on the phone with Raina. "Blake just gave us everything we need," I said, pulling off my jacket and shaking glass fragments onto the hardwood floor. "Physical attack, witnesses, and the perfect justification for what we're about to do." What happened next was like watching a perfectly choreographed explosion in slow motion. Raina had spent years building relationships with financial journalists, business reporters, and industry analysts. The first press release went out at 11:47 p.m., hitting the wire services. Donahue Enterprises' majority shareholder exposes systematic fraud and environmental violations. She fed the complete documentation package to 3 different investigative journalism outlets simultaneously. Not summaries or excerpts, but the actual bank statements, the actual forged inspection reports, the actual emails discussing how to hide money from auditors. Raw, unfiltered evidence that told the story better than any narrative we could have written. I stayed up all night watching it unfold. The first story broke on a financial blog at 1:23 a.m. By 2:15, it had been picked up by Reuters. By 3:30, Bloomberg had confirmed the story. By 4:45, it was trending on Twitter with hashtag Donahue Scandal. Social media was beautiful to watch. Screenshots of documents, infographics explaining the fraud, memes about rich families getting their comeuppance. By sunrise, major news networks were scrambling to confirm the story and get interviews. Blake's face was plastered across every financial news channel by 7 a.m. The photo they kept using was from some charity gala, where he looked particularly smug and entitled, holding a glass of champagne and wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The contrast between that image and the headlines about fraud and attack was perfect. It told the whole story without needing any additional commentary. Around 2 p.m., Miriam showed up at my office looking like she hadn't slept. You ruined us, she said, standing in my doorway like she was afraid to come any closer. I looked up from the acquisition papers I'd been reviewing. No, Miriam, I replied. You ruined yourselves. I just turned the lights on. The board of directors held an emergency meeting that afternoon. The vote wasn't even close. Julian Donahue was removed as chairman by a margin of 8-1, with only Blake voting to support his father. Blake was arrested the next morning for securities fraud. The FBI showed up at his apartment at 6 a.m. with handcuffs and a warrant, and by 7 a.m. footage of him doing the perp walk in his pajamas was all over social media. A week later, Raina called with excitement in her voice, "Carter, you need to get down here right now. I found something that changes everything." In her conference room, she'd been working with forensic accountants, following every digital trail. We found encrypted files buried in Julian's old email server. Voicemails from Gloria Donahue, Miriam and Blake's real mother. Gloria had died in a car accident about 8 years ago before I'd married into the family. She'd been the one decent person in the entire Donahue clan. The voicemails were recorded 6 months before her end. Julian, I know what you and Blake have been doing. I've seen the bank records, the fake invoices, the offshore accounts. This has to stop. But it was the final voicemail that made my hands shake. Recorded the day before Gloria's fatal car accident, her voice scared and desperate. I'm leaving the firm tomorrow. I can't be part of this anymore, Julian. If anything happens to me, if there's any kind of accident, Julian was behind it. He knows I was going to expose him. Single car crash on a rainy night. Ruled accidental due to weather conditions. But Gloria had tried to do the right thing, and they'd eliminated her for it. Julian tried to run. Federal agents caught him at Reagan National Airport, trying to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands with suitcases full of cash and a fake passport. The trial lasted 3 months. Blake got 18 years. Julian got life in prison for homicide. When they read the verdict, he didn't react at all, probably still believing that somehow his money and connections would find a way to save him. 1 year later, I stood in the cemetery where Gloria Donahue was buried, holding white tulips, her favorite flowers. The headstone was simple. Beloved mother and truth teller. You tried to stop them, I said quietly. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to finish what you started. We'd created Wells Energy Solutions from the ashes of their corruption, a company that actually lived up to the values Julian and Blake had only pretended to care about. The Gloria Fund was my proudest achievement, established with money recovered from the Donahue family's offshore accounts, supporting young inventors and entrepreneurs who'd been told they'd never amount to anything. At the fund's dedication ceremony, I saw Miriam in the crowd, looking different, older, more tired, but somehow more real than she'd ever looked during our marriage. I'm proud of what you've built, she said quietly. This is what it should have been all along. Your mother would have loved this, I replied. The empire was real now, built on innovation instead of fraud, powered by hope instead of fear, creating value instead of just extracting it. This was what Gloria had been fighting for in her final days, and what I'd been working toward since that night I'd crashed through those glass doors. Not revenge, not even justice, but the chance to build something better from the ruins of what came before. It was everything I'd ever wanted, and it had been worth every broken piece of glass.